on to this. Good evening, everyone. I just want to welcome everyone to this edition of CSA Voices. We are currently waiting, I think, for the president of CSA, who is Dr. Rhoda Arundel, to join us before we begin. So please give us a few minutes before we start.
Device.
Okay, all right. So good evening, everyone, and we want to just take this opportunity to welcome you all to this edition of CSA Voices. My name is Meagan Sylvester. I am the CSA newsletter editor of the Caribbean Studies Association, as well as this year's program chair for our 2025 conference. I'm now going to invite our president, Dr. Rhoda Arundel, to bring greetings on behalf of the organization.
Okay, good afternoon to you, Megan. Thank you so much. As Megan said, my name is Rhoda Arundel. I'm from St. Martin, and this year I have the honor and the privilege actually to host the CSA conference in St. Martin. I still say it's the most beautiful place on the planet. And I want to begin first by thanking the initiators of this discussion this evening. I'll start primarily first with Dr. O'Neill Hall, who is the initiator, and the moderator, Meagan Sylvester, and as well as the two discussants, Shrimpton, Dr. Shrimpton and Dr. Jones. I want to thank you for taking the initiative and for making this possible. I'm not a woman of a lot of words, so all I want to say here this evening is I'm grateful to see the increase in interest, both in the conference and in the other activities that people are asking about. So I'm really delighted about that. I know that the team is working very hard to make this a very memorable experience in St. Martin. And so we're encouraging you, if you have not yet registered, please register, please tell your friend, tell another friend. We guarantee you this year's CSA conference is going to leave a mark with you as you move forward. But more importantly, I'm looking forward to the discussion this evening. And before we get into that, I just want to remind us that the conference theme this year was chosen after much discussion with a number of people, but also because of my personal conviction and because of the opportunity on this platform to share St. Martin, but not just St. Martin, the work that is being done in the global reparations movement with our CSA membership and with the wider Caribbean. And so I'm looking forward that as people like me who live in St. Martin, which is still a very colonized space, work towards, decolonization of St. Martin and the region, and we are looking inward as island nations, looking to how we can move further into the Caribbean in terms of regional integration. We're also grateful for conversations like these that we're having this evening that will be able to add to that discussion. So with that said, I want to wish you all welcome, and I look forward to the discussion and especially the question and answer period at the end.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Arundel. Dr. Hall, do you have any information that you want to share with us? Okay.
It is my pleasure to welcome you all as the coordinator of CSA Voices, a platform dedicated to amplifying the perspectives of Caribbean scholars and thought leaders at a time when our region stands at a critical crossroads. The Caribbean is in a pivotal moment. This year alone, a significant number of our nations will head to the polls, determining the course of governance for years to come. But beyond the ballot box, we face urgent and interconnected challenges, the intensifying impacts of climate change, rising poverty, soaring food prices, shifting foreign policies, devastating storms, and ever complex realities of migration. These issues do not exist in isolation. They shape the daily lives of our people and the future of our region. That is why CSA Voices is more important than ever. This initiative, born out of the mandate from our St. Lucia conference, is a call to action, a recognition that the voices of Caribbean scholars, researchers, and practitioners must be heard, engaged, and most importantly, heeded. Through our collective knowledge and critical discourse, we have the power to inform policy, challenge assumptions, and offer solutions rooted in the lived realities of our people. As we move forward, I invite you to use this space to share your insights, exchange ideas, and contribute to shaping a Caribbean that is not only resilient, but also thriving. Let us ensure that CSA Voices remains a beacon of scholarship and advocacy for the issues that matter most to our region. Thank you, and I look forward to our journey together.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Hall, for that. And we now want to fully open our session for today. As you have been hearing, the name of our session today, and if you were aware, receiving messages from CSA, you would know that this is a series entitled CSA Voices, and this is the second tranche in 4 sessions that we plan to have. Today we are going to be hearing from Dr. Maggie Shrimpton and Dr. Natalie Dietrich Jones. All right. In terms of brevity, I'm not going to read their bios to you, but I am definitely going to give you a sense of what they will be speaking about. I'm going to invite Dr. Maggie Shrimpton to start, and I'm going to let you know that the title of her presentation today is Island and Mainland Connections in the Caribbean Space. All right, so Dr. Shrimpton, take it away.
Thank you, Megan. Okay. Thank you very much, Megan, for that introduction, and good afternoon, good evening, everyone. First of all, thank you, O'Neill and the Caribbean Voices team for organizing these sessions and for inviting me to participate. It really is my pleasure. Thank you, Megan, for hosting, and Natalie for sharing this space. I hope you can see, I've turned on the automatic subtitles. It's a bit of an experiment with AI. There's probably going to be some very weird translations, but in an attempt to bring some linguistic diversity to the talk, then well, we're experimenting. So bear with me. It may not work, but hopefully it will be useful. I'll try and speak slowly. I've done a few test runs and I don't think it recognizes my funny English accent very well, but we'll see. Thank you, everyone. I'd like to begin with the following epigraph from Carlos Cubero's 2011 article, Caribbean Insular Mobilities. Sorry, I have to move this, there we go. And I open the quotes. Cubero says, "My intention is to place representations of insularity in relation to markers of mobility, and to argue that mobility and insularity create a positive tension through which Caribbean islanders experience continuities and change." Close quotation. Cubero is a fascinating scholar of Puerto Rican origin, now living, I believe, in Eastern Europe, but I discovered his work through the Island Studies Group, who are producing fabulous work on islands. Islandness, island conditions, island everything. Most of the group was at that point, just a decade ago, centered in the Pacific Ocean, and Carlo was one of a group of a few exciting authors participating with them, working on the Caribbean island experience. So this epigraph speaks specifically to two lines of thought that run through much of my work and in and within the mainland Caribbean, that is mobility and insularity. The images on the slide speak to a third line of thought that is to challenge imaginaries and visualizations. For example, how does our approach to the Caribbean change if we look at it from a different viewpoint? It's a simple question, but if we center on the mainland Caribbean instead of the islands, what changes? So for me, these images provoke these kinds of questions of change. They're all aerial photographs and enable us to look at the relations between sea and land, or between water, mangrove, and jungle, or, for example, in this last one, the hidden towns within. As my title today suggests, my work is centered on the mainland Caribbean. While I obviously recognize that a tremendous variety of different languages are spoken across the Caribbean region, and these are also in constant flux, and frequently many more than one language is spoken in any given space, and St. Martin is a very good example of this, I do not, however, approach my teaching or my research from linguistic blocks, which I and many others see as reproducing colonial constructs. I do not work on the Spanish Caribbean, although I often work in Spanish. Instead, I look at Caribbean space and the diverse identity processes within and across the region, exploring patterns of connection and disconnection in the literary production of the region. This involves both panoramic literary studies and specific case studies. So far in Yucatan mostly, and to a lesser extent, but growing in Belize and in Guyana, where the specific has taken a slightly different turn, as islandness and mobility have led me to the poetry of Maggie Harris, born in New Amsterdam and now living in the UK, and what we have called migrant poetics and interrupted genealogies. I'll come back to that, I hope. So here I would like to highlight two of the key conceptual and methodological starting points for this work on the mainland Caribbean. First, as I've already alluded to, the focus on islands, the group of research from the Island Studies Group, and their work on insular cultures as dynamic systems, particularly looking at the island not as an isolated unit, but with all the dichotomies of openness and closedness, or openness and isolation that we associate with island living. So with dynamic systems, with particular patterns of connectivity and disconnectivity. And this has enabled me to look at islanders also from within the mainland Caribbean. So how different regions within the Caribbean mainland may also play out certain island identities, certain island tropes, for example, in the literature. The second point is limits and boundaries, frontiers, boundaries, and limits. My particular interest here is in scholarly and creative work that is looking at fluctuating and porous boundaries and how these play into national, continental, insular, and diasporic limits, or lack of, and the ways in which this leads to negotiating lived experience and to the creation of different regional and national imaginaries. We can find these ideas also playing out in poetry and fiction across the region. And this leads me to what I've been doing myself, a series of my own studies that focused initially on the Yucatan in Southeast Mexico, but then moved towards southwards across Belize and Guyana. And I argue that these literary discourses are built up from patterns that thrive on rootedness and connectivity, raíz y rizoma, and move as in a pendulum motion between national and regional identities, and usually using both. So the study of specific writers and spaces reveals to me, on the one hand, roots and core ideas that outline deeply rooted identity constructions and a sense of belonging to specific towns, villages, and places. This is usually very strongly represented in fiction and poetry. But also this allows us to map the complex rhizomatic connections between these repeating places that take pride in their rootedness, as well as acknowledging a connectivity across the region. So these are some of the elements that I've been looking at. But if we look at it in a conceptual map, for example, I work through to the, if we work through to the bottom line, islandness and looking at the tropes, images and imaginaries that can build this up. I've been looking at hurricane stories, roots, rootedness, jungle, mangrove. Maggie Harris introduced botanical gardens into the mix, and all sorts of pathways and routes across the region, whether we're going north-south or south-north in the mainland Caribbean or east-west towards in and out of the island region. When I got to work with Guyana, I began to focus specifically on women writers, and this brought out a whole series of different and important areas of work, which again goes back to the original slide when I was talking about mobility and insularity, and I hope to talk about that towards the end of this talk. So as you, I hope, will have been able to realize, visualizations are very important for me, and the way different cartographies of the Caribbean seem to highlight or focus or center on different aspects of the Caribbean has been very interesting. I chose particularly this map and a couple that are on the next slides, because this enables us to look at both the island Caribbean, the northern arc of this map, and the southern arc of this map, as in terms of the quotation on the right hand side here, which is from Wilson Harris, where he describes the Caribbean as a bridge of rhythm, arcing or curving from pre-Columbian Mexico to pre-Columbian and post-Columbian Guyanas. It always drew my attention that he focused on mainland areas as his point, as starting and ending point. And if we look at them on the map, how they enable us to form this circle. So we have a mainland arc of island territories that are not islands surrounded by water, but they're islands surrounded by land. And they play out certain island characteristics in the relationship to their surrounding regional or national or continental areas. If we think about Yucatan in relation to the rest of Mexico, Belize in Central America, and Guyana, for example, in the north of South America. I will expand on this as we go through. Two further maps. I mentioned earlier the importance of some specific tropes like the hurricane for reading the Caribbean. Again, this arose from much of the poetry that's written in the Caribbean region, and obviously with our living with hurricanes crop up a lot in poetry. But one particular poet in Belize went a little bit further, and he spoke of living in the hurricane zone. This is Yasser Musa from Belize. And I was keen to find a map that might be able to visualize this, and I came upon this fantastic map on the right-hand side of your screens that shows hurricane breakpoints, and it is exactly it outlines exactly the double circles of the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico. It is called the Gulf of Mexico. And so I found this a very interesting way of enabling us to think outside of the colonial constructs of language zones and look at the Caribbean in a different way. As I said, this started off with, I live in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mérida, and this started off here, again, thinking about the ways in which Yucatan has played out this island imaginary. If we look at this series of maps that were produced between 1525 and 1532, we can see this first 1525 map where Yucatan, this is Yucatan, reproduced or drawn in the map as some kind of blob floating in the sea. It's not a peninsula, it's not connected to a landmass. It is 2 years later in the following map. This is a surprisingly detailed map in 1527, and we see the connection to the mainland. However, this then changes again in 1529 and in 1532, where the series again, has Yucatan more as a floating island. This is interesting because in any case, there's so many things that are different about Yucatan. If we think about it in relation to the rest of Mexico, it is a peninsula, and we could compare to perhaps the peninsula on the other side of the country, Baja California, which is also distinctly different through this peninsula connotation, and also because of the isolation that Yucatan has lived for very, very many centuries during the colonial period and afterwards. We don't have rich agricultural land. It's a very arid peninsula. It's difficult to make things grow. It wasn't of much interest for Spain when they colonized, so it was largely sort of forgotten on the eastern edge of the country. And it wasn't until the 20th century that a railroad was built in the 1950s and a roadway was built in the 1970s. So you will understand how isolated from the rest of the country Yucatan was. However, it wasn't isolated from the Caribbean, and there's always been a strong link, particularly to the closer islands like Cuba and through Belize, also from Belize to Jamaica. So the connections with the Caribbean were always stronger for very many years. Certainly when I was first here in the 1980s, people would say, what do you want to go to Mexico City for? And it was much easier to fly to Havana, to be honest. So that kind of, all this is kind of in the background of why I started working on Yucatan in some ways as an island. The literature of the 20th century, this early work in 1934, speaks to this distinctiveness which Yucatecans try to build up all through the 20th century. Yucatan, the country that seems like no other. Yucatan, el país que no se parece a otro. And towards the end of the 20th century, in 1998, by a book by Hernán Lara Zavala, who unfortunately died just a couple of weeks ago. He wrote this beautiful travel book called Journey to the Heart of the Peninsula, which again plays into this idea of an area that is unknown, that has hidden depths, hidden interiors. And again, for me, this has been very interesting because it plays strongly into the idea that I've been developing more recently about the interiors of our islands, because so much seems to focus on the coastline, and our islands are not just coastlines, they're not just sand and paradise, a lot happens inside. So this has always been an iconic book for me, which I've been bringing back more into my conceptualizations recently. I'm going to jump a little bit to the second quotation here. I think we've been talking quite a lot about in the first quotation, which is from Edward Glisson, about how Caribbean islands have this dichotomic open-closed system. Islands are not insulated spaces. But for the mainland Caribbean, what Nadia Celis says here in the middle quotation is particularly important because she highlights that tension and conflict that happens in mainland Caribbean spaces, where particularly in where we have perhaps Belize in Central America or Yucatan within Mexico, where there's a tension between the national discourse, the national narrative, and the narratives, plural, that are being produced in other areas of the country. So for Yucatan, if you think of Yucatan from Mexico City, it's thought of as exclusively a Maya area, Maya Indian area, indigenous population, which plays into the mestizo national narrative. But that's not what happens when you're actually in Yucatan. So there's to think of Yucatan in relation to the Caribbean implies a rupture and a break with the national narrative. And that's what I've been trying to also to develop. I think it's very important. As Nadia says, it's important to reflect on the resistance from Caribbean cultural identities within nations that do not see themselves as Caribbean. So I think I'm going to run out of time. How am I doing for time? Does anybody jump in and let me know?
You're doing well. I mean, you have a few more minutes, about 5
Okay.
more minutes, yeah.
Good. Thank you. So some of the questions that have come up for me that are very important for me to working through this island list, the tropes of island in the mainland Caribbean, is to think of the Caribbean as more than just islands. That's clearly evident in bringing in the mainland Caribbeans. Also to think of in which ways do the mainlands interact? Is this idea of the island feasible? What happens inside and inland the islands? And here I don't think Samuel is with us at the moment, although he was hoping to be able to come. Samuel Duo is a colleague at my university, is a geographer and works on community tourism in Yucatan, and develops the idea of what he calls the traspaís, sometimes translated in English to hinterland. And I prefer to use inland or interiors. So what is happening behind the coast in the interior spaces. And also in the case of writers, what is happening outside of the capital city? Because Mérida, where I live, in some ways built up an image of being synonymous with the whole peninsula. So writers from Mérida were the Yucatecan writers with capital letters. And writers who are writing outside of the main cities and outside of the capital were not published to the same extent, were not considered as important. And this was concerning to me because if we think of how I was thinking about the rootedness and the writing from specific places, looking at how each writer relates to place and how it relates its place to other places, the writers in the interior of the Yucatan Peninsula were extremely important. So I began looking at those, some of the writers from the communities, and I think that brought in some of the most interesting discussions that I had towards the end of this particular stage of research, which ended around 2021. The starting point, we should probably go back to this quotation here from around 2010. David Anouar is now a consolidated writer, but he was at that point a student. And he was struggling with my idea of Yucatan being part of the Caribbean, although he himself is from Cancun, which is slap in the middle of the paradise connotations of the Caribbean coast in Mexico, in Yucatan. And eventually he came to me and he said, I've got it, you know, kind of eureka moment. He said, I realized that if I stand with my back with my back to the sea, I can look at Yucatan as if it were an island surrounded by jungle. So all this mass of jungle, if you fly over Yucatan, this picture at the top, if you fly over Yucatan, that's what you see. And I think that it's beautiful in this particular photo because the little pink spots of flowers are all populations. That's where there'll be flame trees and bougainvilleas and villages, little islands surrounded by jungle. And coupled with an idea that came from another poet, Mayra Santos Febres, who you may well know, the audience may know, is a very well-known Puerto Rican writer. After her first visit to Yucatan, and we were able to take her around quite a bit, she wrote on her blog, she said, in Mérida, I learned to appreciate a Maya Caribbean that spreads across the whole peninsula. And I thought that was very interesting that she perceived that Maya Caribbeanness from the interior, the villages on the interior. It was fascinating. This map here is also, it's too small for you to be able to see probably, but it's interesting in Yucatan, the toponymics also plays out this relationship with the coast and the interior, as many of our coastal ports, fishing villages, have the same name as the towns that are a little bit a few kilometers inland from the coast. One will say Zilam Pueblo, and one will say Zilam Puerto, Zilam Village and Zilam Port, for example. And so there's always this connection, or often this connection between the inland towns and the coastal fishing villages. So for me, just to be able to have work that would only consider Yucatan Caribbean if it focused on the coast seemed somehow desperately incomplete. And so I found ways to look at what happened in the interior. And the hurricane, I think, is the clearest example of this. I mean, I could give many others, but this is just in the interest of time. I think the clearest, the most iconic example. So when I was reading Yasser Musa, and here you see the full quotation where he talks about being a man with words in his head, walking and living is very important in the hurricane zone. I began to think of all the poetry that's produced in the Caribbean about the hurricanes, and I thought, well, what happens in Yucatan about hurricanes? We have so many of them, and although they don't always hit us head on, they're always there, and we're always waiting for them, and they're always being traced. So I began to look, and this is just a very small example, but it was not surprising to find hurricane stories around the coastal area, and the red arrows, which I made in anti-clockwise, are from the main coastal areas, and there are plenty of hurricane stories there. What I was happily surprised to find are the blue arrows and the little yellow dots, if you can see them, which are small villages in the interior where there are poets and writers also writing about hurricanes. And here there's just half a dozen examples. And I put the arrows in different directions to sort of simulate the movement of the hurricane. And so this is what I'm trying to trace within the literary discourses of the region. So I'm trying to highlight the insular spaces, the inside or insular spaces that gain relevance alongside the coastal areas, and therefore avoid characterizing the Caribbean only as a seascape. So just to finish with where I'm at now, I've been working for the last year or so on women writers in and from Guyana, and in using digital, I'm learning about digital humanities and how to do maps and visualizations. I haven't the evidence yet because I haven't dominated the apps, but I'm getting there. This is Maggie Harris, born in New Amsterdam, Guyana in 1954, and she migrated to the UK in 1971. No relation to Wilson Harris, but that is part of the intrigue, or let's say the family name Harris, in her case, comes through what I call interrupted genealogies. A different genealogy to the Wilson Harris line and to the Jan Carew line. Maggie's work situates the lived experience of women at the center of a series of discussions on migrant identities that she explores across different peoplescapes and ecologies. Her stories are told through her poetry, weave the threads of interrupted genealogies of the migrant experience. And I'm interrupted because of a whole number that we are all very well aware of colonial violence that creates and uproots people. So the interrupted genealogies of the migrant experience are combined in her work with those of the uprooted ecological genealogies, as she traces the displacements of human bodies, seeds, and plants through the violence of colonial history. And what I'm trying to do is to visualize the peoplescapes and her stories and the roots, along with the gaps and the interruptions through the digital humanities. I want to visualize the points on her journey and other writers, so that we can create some very interesting, I think, maps which go far beyond just I was born in one place and I now live in another. There's a lot of stops along the journey which I would like to put into these maps. And this also has become significantly important for me, because when we were exploring the biographies particularly of women writers in the Caribbean, and particularly in the case of Guyana, well, not particularly in the case of Guyana, I think really across the region, there's so many silences. It's so difficult to, you can find the work, but you can't find the biographies, or you find biographies that are generated, in the case of Maggie, for example, information that crops up in all sorts of UK publications where they just say she was born in Guyana, as if, looking at Guyana from the UK, it's a big place. They just leave it as a blob, over there. But Guyana is a place with so many places on the map. I said, well, okay, well, I want to know where in Guyana and in which street in New Amsterdam and who were her neighbors. How does she tie into so many writers that have come out of New Amsterdam, for example? I asked her that question. So we need to do so much more with our biographies. I mean, we don't need to be nosy, but it's interesting to see the journeys that people have made. And as I said at the beginning, Caribbean is a mobile place. We're not generally a static population. People come and go for all sorts of reasons, even though they almost always come back. So that is a little bit where I'm at now, working with Maggie's work. This is, I've been looking at journeys about migrant poetics and how we get to a particular language in her migrant poetics, which is a language that recovers and uses savageness and wildness. Again, the interrupted genealogies and the space of a migrant woman, the space, her space as a migrant, the migrant experience as a woman. And she's not just isolating either the departure or the arrival, but everything that goes in between, which is so interesting and refreshing. So I will finish now. For me, the Caribbean is about patterns. It's about patterns and processes, roots, constant movement. It's a hurricane. There are imaginaries and representations, shared ideas, lived experience, diversity, porous boundaries, linguistic chaos, hybridity, conflict. There's a sea space, islands, mainlands, diasporas, and island-like spaces, insular spaces in landlocked areas. There is colonialism still. There is a decolonial process of resistance and a construction of us, which we must keep doing. And finally, these are some verses from poets who actually both of them were students of mine and now are very successful writers themselves, Manuel Iris and Juan Esteban Chavez. Words are also migrants. Manuel about 15 years ago, 12, 15 years ago, migrated to the States, to the US. And we have found a new way of connecting to each other through his and mine realization that we are migrants. I didn't say, but I was born in the UK and I've been living in Yucatan for more than half of my life. So words are also migrants is something that has resonated deeply with me. And Juan Esteban, a long time ago, wrote a small book in which one of the final lines of the book is Nuestra tierra de ninguna parte, our land from nowhere. And as you see on the left, the quote from Maggie Harris, where she speaks of migrants never really feeling that they belong anywhere, and that she long ago realized that her art is created on that cusp of unbelonging. I think that's so powerful. That broken edge of despair and reason and hope. And home is where I live now. And you can put a name on that, but it's not always going to be the same place. So thank you all very much for listening. I hope I haven't gone on too long and not missed out too much. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Shrimpton. We really appreciate you sharing that powerful presentation with us. To everyone who is on the line, in the interest of time, what we're going to do is we're going to go to Dr. Natalie Dietrich Jones for her to do her presentation, and then we're going to invite questions. You can put your questions in the chat and we will field them at the end of her presentation. I just want to give an opportunity to Dr. Dietrich Jones by saying, letting us all know what she's going to be speaking about. Oh, there it is on the screen. A whole of society approach to supporting migrants and refugees, a response in the Southern Caribbean to the Venezuelan migration crisis. Take it away, Dr. Jones.
Okay, thank you, Meagan, and thanks to CSA for extending the invitation. I think my first presentation on this multi-sited project was at CSA, so in a way, this is a continuity of work in different respects. This is an amended presentation of a topic I've been looking at since 2019. I've been doing field work in 4 countries affected by the Venezuelan migration crisis in the Southern Caribbean. So I'll explain a little bit more, but I wanted to clarify what the topic means. I recently, for another study, was doing an assessment of Trinidad and came across a mention in their voluntary national report on the SDGs of a whole of society approach to addressing migrant needs. And immediately, like, alarm bells went off in my head, because based on what I've been observing for the past, say, 5 to 6 years, it is not necessarily characterized by a whole of society approach. So the presentation is querying that, not just for Trinidad, but for the 3 other countries that I examined. So I'll just get into that in a second. But just to say to Maggie, even though our presentations are very different, there may still be some connections, because the migration is from a mainland country to the islands, but also this issue of the continuity of colonialism, which is shaping the migration policy frameworks in these 4 different countries. So in the interest of time, so Venezuela since 2014 has been experiencing migratory crisis. It's a compounded crisis, because it is a humanitarian crisis on top of an economic recession. The migration from Venezuela since 2014 has changed the nature of the country's migratory patterns. So once Venezuela was a receiver of migrants, it is now a sender of migrants. But Venezuelan migration is not a recent phenomenon, and we know certainly in the case of the Southern Caribbean, there have been bidirectional flows for centuries. But something changed in 2014 with this humanitarian crisis, and we saw an escalation of outward migration from Venezuela, which peaked, say, around 2018. That has been characterized by increased precarity of migrants and heightened surveillance at borders. And we're likely to see, we're not sure yet what will happen, but with the recent change in the US immigration policy and the end to TPS for Haitians and Venezuelans, that there may be further changes or impact on the Caribbean region. So this is where I've been focused, the Southern Caribbean, the area highlighted in red, and doing research on Aruba, Curacao, Guyana, and Trinidad and Tobago, and the way that these small island developing states, which Guyana is also characterized, despite being a mainland territory, based on the vulnerabilities that it experiences. So what has been the response of these states to the Venezuelan migration crisis? Right, so in order to do that research, I had initially started out, because I'm a qualitative researcher, trying to get some expert interviews done. I didn't get as many as I thought, and as colleague and I, who worked on Trinidad and Tobago specifically, we've written on the methodological challenges surrounding research on migration governance. So when expert interviews did not yield as much as both of us liked, we changed gears a little bit to look at archival research, documentary analysis with a focus on discourse analysis. So we examine different legislative documents, policy documents, in order to kind of get a bird's eye view of what was happening on the ground in the respective case studies. What this presentation will focus on is a type of socio-legal review based on reports to the Universal Periodic Review, and then reports from UNHCR and other agencies working on the ground in these islands and explaining the policy developments as they occur. What is interesting about these countries, the most affected by the Venezuelan migration crisis in the Dutch and Anglophone Caribbean. And in 2018, the UNHCR had indicated that the crisis was on the scale of Syria, right? So very small countries, as you can see in the table on the right, relatively speaking, the largest being Trinidad and Tobago based on population size, and I believe also in geographical size. That the changes in arrivals, which you can see trending from 1990 to 2019, with the most significant being arrivals in Trinidad and Tobago. Changing the stock of the migrant population and the composition of the migrant population. So the figures are slightly different now based on what is reported on the platform that the UNHCR coordinates, but except in Aruba and Curacao, not much difference for Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago. So for Aruba, it's down to about 11%, and for Curacao, 7%. But large arrivals, unanticipated arrivals, and in a space, which I'll clarify in a second, a space that is not prepared to receive migrants based on a weak governance structure. So I'll explain that now. So the expectation would be that in order to respond appropriately to the needs of asylum seekers and refugees and other migrants in need of protection, that there is a legislative framework in place, which would essentially be domestication of the provisions of the 1951 Refugee Convention and the 1967 Protocol, which accompanies that convention. But what we have in the region is a state of non-ratification, even for Trinidad, which has signed onto the convention. It has argued in its court system that signature does not mean ratification because there is no legislation governing refugee protection. So no ratification in all the 4 countries, and a lack of legislative and policy frameworks to deal with unanticipated arrivals of vulnerable migrants. Since the crisis emerged, there has been some work to kind of change that. So we see in Trinidad that a draft policy was developed, and in response to some deportations in Curacao, Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights was invoked through a special policy. But by and large, there are no dedicated provisions to address the rights of refugees and migrants in need of protection, and that has implications on the ground. So if we did have a whole of society approach, what we would see is domestication of international commitments, economic integration of migrants, appropriate reception procedures. So when persons arrive, usually by sea, not only by sea, but usually by sea, how does the state respond to them? And then social integration mechanisms. So to answer that, I'm gonna focus on 3 elements. So just in summary, what we see on the ground is there is no legal basis for refugee status determination, no work permit regime, limited reception, and limited social integration. And I will just, explain what that looks like for migrants. So in 3 countries, Trinidad and Tobago being the exception, there is no work permit regime in place. So what happens is that persons arrive in these countries and they are unable to find formal work. So they usually tend to participate in the informal labor market, which heightens their vulnerability. So they're subject to exploitation in work, low pay, little recourse to the law if they are exploited or abused by their employers. And Trinidad sought to address that, which is this whole of society approach that they mentioned in the Voluntary National Report, by introducing a permit regime, but that permit regime is only available to registered migrants who would have participated in a registration exercise, one in 2019, and then I think 2 subsequent ones one in 2020, and I believe another in 2021. So migrants are unable to work in the formal labor market and are forced to undertake work in informal labor sector, which results in their de-skilling as well. And this has been written on recently in a co-edited volume on qualitative research that I'm a co-author on. In response to that, though, the civil society has been offering training to bilingual training to Venezuelan migrants in order to try to address any deficits that would facilitate their integration or inclusion in the labor market. Access to healthcare and access to education is probably where we've seen the most traction. So Trinidad and Tobago developed guidelines that outlined what levels of care Venezuelan migrants and other migrants would have access to. But in Curacao, healthcare is still limited to those who can afford private health insurance. In Guyana, we also see access to public healthcare. And so to fill that deficit, again, the NGO and civil society community has stepped in to provide a range of services, largely around reproductive healthcare, healthcare for LGBTQI persons, and maternal health care and immunization as well, in order to address the deficits that the state has not been able to fill because it does not facilitate access to health care for these migrants. It was only last year, I think December last year, that Venezuelan migrant children were able to access the public education system through a change in the immigration law, because they would have normally been required to have a student visa. They also have access to education in Guyana, but there are, and in Curacao and Aruba, but there are still some barriers because of limited capacity within the education system. Right. I think the weakest area, which stems from the issue before about ratification, is what refugee status determination procedures are in place to allow for migrants who may have a well-founded claim to initiate a process where they would seek asylum. So there is no domestication of the 1951 Refugee Convention or the protocol. And we haven't seen, despite recommendations in the UPR and through other international organizations, that these countries ratify the convention and or the protocol. What we have seen, however, is an acceleration of a securitized approach to migration, where in Aruba, for example, there's a migration chain, which includes the Coast Guard and other security forces that are detaining and summarily deporting Venezuelan migrants. All right. And then lastly, in this area is, I think, a positive note in terms of migrants trying to enhance their protection and ensure their human rights are protected through the court system. So there have been some court cases at the domestic and regional level which challenge this exclusionary arrangement that migrants have encountered. In the interest of time, I will not provide much details on these, but I can answer in the Q&A to say what exactly they entail, because I do have a comment at the end about what these court cases reveal. So what the analysis shows, and I had to go very quickly and condense some things because for Aruba and Curacao, the arrangement is very different because they remain, they're post-colonial states to a degree. They remain within the country of the Netherlands, and so things like their foreign relations and military response is still dictated by The Hague, so in the Netherlands. And I can speak to that some more in the Q&A for anyone that's interested. But what essentially it shows is, despite the parallels between the cases, it's still necessary to analyze each country on a case-by-case basis in order to understand the depth and scope of this whole of society approach. What is interesting for me is that Guyana, which had the least resilient capacity, so the weakest governance framework, it has not ratified the convention, even though it had indicated in about 2016 that it wanted to, has been the most receptive to Venezuelan migrants. And in part, this has to do with the fact that they're receiving returnee indigenous populations. So Guyanese persons or persons with Guyanese descent who can claim Guyanese nationality have been returning from Venezuela. Aruba and Curacao reflect an inflexible migration policy regime, which is a reflection of its post-colonial governance structures. So it's actually, both countries were arguing that the Netherlands, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, should have intervened to provide funding, for example, to address the heightened arrivals. But what we actually saw, which is something I've written on in a paper that's supposed to come out soon, is this contest of responsibility, and where the Kingdom of the Netherlands did intervene, it was to provide further funding to enhance the securitized border regime. And so, as an example, to build up further the detention facility that housed migrants, rather than, for example, build a school that could accommodate migrant children. So the changes in Trinidad and Tobago are trending towards the positive, but this is largely in response to external and some internal pressures. rather than initiated independently by the government of Trinidad and Tobago. And the emerging jurisprudence is actually reinforcing migrants' exclusion because what we've seen, for example, in the case that was brought before Trinidad and Tobago, is the judge in the highest court indicating that it is legal to deport migrants because the Trinidad and Tobago has not ratified the convention. And so without domestic legislation in place to protect migrants, the country is within its rights to return vulnerable migrants to Venezuela. But there are some opportunities in terms of how we can move ahead. So in the paper that was condensed for this presentation, I had argued that crises can create, there are tipping points that can allow for countries to adapt and learn how to respond to vulnerable migrants, and that rather than have a reactive response, that these crises can allow them to develop anticipatory adaptive capacity. And this would be through embedding migrant protection in legislation, so that would require reform, and trying to address the inherent vulnerabilities which limit the country's capacity to respond, so limited technical and human resources that would be critical to achieving this whole of society approach. So I'll end there, and hopefully if there are any questions about details that I had to go over very quickly, then I can address them in the Q&A.
Okay, so thank you so very much, Dr. Jones. We really appreciate your presentation. And I must indicate that there are a lot of synergies between, Dr. Shrimpton's presentation and Dr. Jones' presentation, especially in terms of islandness and the concept of migration. We want to move quickly to the Q&A, and I noticed that Nicholas Watts had a question right off. He says that he is interested to hear from Maggie about the role of botanical gardens in whether it's addressed by Maggie Harris and others, and which botanical gardens she includes.
Just finding something. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Nicholas, for the question. Yes, it was fascinating to find this in Maggie's work, and it made me think about things I hadn't thought about before. I don't know why, but I just hadn't got there. When I first found her book of poetry, which is called After a Visit to a Botanical Garden, I thought she was maybe talking about the botanical garden in Georgetown. That it turns out that she wasn't, but I thought that because there's one of the painters who I greatly admire from Guyana, called Bernadette Persaud, has a fantastic series of paintings called The Gentleman in the Garden, which are a portrayal of the violence that was lived during the Forbes Burnham period. And she has a series of paintings where this violence is portrayed in the connection of within the botanical garden. And so I was thinking, maybe Maggie's writing poetry about this. And so I asked her, and she said no. She said her botanical garden was the botanical garden in Wales, in the town where she lives, but the National Botanical Garden of Wales. And she was looking at the botanical garden as a cornerstone of the colonial project of control, exploitation, and desire. And so if we think about when the botanical gardens started out, right at the beginning of this process, in the case of the English Caribbean and the English colonialism, we have botanical gardens, I think, at the end of the 16th century, at the end of the 17th century. And they started off as projects for the British to develop, to bring plants. They extracted, they uprooted, and this is what she's talking about, the uprooting of the plants that are taken to these botanical gardens for them to be able to develop medicines, agriculture, other scientific developments, with which they are then able to either gain a better quality of life for the colonizers in what they consider to be uninhabitable places, or for them to be able to develop better resistance to crop infection and everything, and so get better yields on the crops that they were growing in the countries that they had colonized. After that, we get the stage when the botanical gardens become places of desire and leisure for the rich. So, you know, we'll go for the rich and wealthy in London, we'll go for a walk in Kew Gardens. So again, the exploitation and the use of, and the glorification and the idea of paradise that comes out of that. And so she started writing her book about the visit to the botanical garden. The lyrical voice aligns with the weeds and the destructive, the what's the word I'm looking for? The interventions, the disruptiveness of the weeds that are wrapping themselves around the colonial plants of desire and control. So and then this lyrical voice very clearly is a woman, and so there's all sorts of things that get threaded through, which is why I was explaining in the presentation that she links the uprooting of plants and ecologies to the human experience as well. And so I think that's a very fascinating way, and it makes us think about how broad and controlling this colonial project was. It functions on so many levels, you know, agriculture, medicine, I mean, and the British were so, well, I probably not only the British, but the British were so incisive and insidious with this, and the recently independent countries in the 19th century in Latin America, at the beginning of their independence was way before the abolition of the slave trade. So the British then got into problems because they could no longer extract either people or plants, and they seemed, you know, but they still did it illegally, but on both cases. So they stole seeds, which had been written into the independence declarations in Peru, for example. It was very fascinating to find out that it was written into the independence declaration that the local indigenous plants could not be trafficked, you know, could not be exported, and they still stole them, you know. So there's so much to do, Rhoda, on reparations, ecological reparations too. So it's a whole, you know, I think it's a very interesting area that I hadn't really thought about. Thank you, Nicholas. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Thank you.
Okay, so we see that Neskins has a question for Natalie. Do you think the rise of Trumpism in the US will encourage Caribbean countries to adopt stricter immigration policies toward Venezuelans and other migrant groups? Thank you for that.
That was not me.
Was
Sorry.
it? Okay.
No, that was Dr. O'Neill.
Ah, Dr. O'Neill. Cool. Okay.
Can I quickly ask my
Apologies.
question? Can I go ahead and ask my question?
Yes, I think because you indicated that you had to leave soon. Okay.
Yes.
Sure.
So, hello everybody. It's my first time here. Thank you so much for having me. Professionally, I am an anti-bullying trainer, where I provide training in school and organization to create a non-toxic environment. So my work mostly focused around unity, collaboration, active allyship, but also accountability, which brought up my question when I saw the slide regarding the healthcare and the all the amount of NGOs in different Caribbean region. I was born and raised in Haiti, and in Haiti we have this NGO system where they pretty much don't really partner with the local community. They just come in with all the resources, and that continue to keep the community more dependent on them, which is hurting the community around their self-sufficiency and their ability to take care of themselves. So my question is, around your studies, Ms. John, have there NGOs rather from the Catholic organization and other organization, are they partnering with the local community, and is there any type of accountability that is built around the way they are operating across the Caribbean?
Okay, so thanks for the questions. I'll respond to the first one about the impact of changes based on the US election. So I think it can go either way. But I'll preface that by saying that without the change in administration, Caribbean governments do operate a fairly restrictive regime. We were seeing that with Haitian nationals in Jamaica who were detained on arrival, actually fined in the courts. And it was not until a local NGO stepped in that they were given the opportunity to indicate that they wanted to claim for asylum. So even before the shift in the US regime, we saw a restrictive framework in place in the region. So I've been on other panels where we've talked about what we think the potential implication of the US election would be. I would say that it's important for them to accelerate any procedural changes they would want to make to enhance a framework that could positively respond to migrants and enhance migrant protection. The change in the TPS system, for example, and the parole program could result in even more arrivals. And rather than increased fear and xenophobia, what should happen is countries assess their frameworks to see in what way they could operate a more inclusive framework. And part of the argument around that is that, and a lot of people are not aware that this is happening unless you're in like demography. So our societies are changing, right? We have aging populations. We have high outward immigration of skilled people. So from the side of socioeconomic integration, it could be a positive move to be more receptive because these persons can fill critical gaps in our health sector, in our education system, and in other areas that need it. So even if we weren't doing it for a moral purpose, there is, or altruistic purpose, there is a socioeconomic imperative to actually be receptive to migrants. In terms of the NGOization, this is something I would actually like to work on. We've seen an increased footprint of overseas NGOs operating in the migration protection space, but they're actually complementing work that is being done by local NGOs. So there is some synergy. The overseas NGO, I can think of HIAS in particular, that is a Jewish NGO. That's the main one that's offering the reproductive and other healthcare services. But before HIAS came, Red Cross was there, and Red Cross actually was helping with RSD with UNHCR. The church, the Catholic Church in both countries, they were working with Red Cross in order to provide support to migrants. So it has been positive in the sense that they're providing services for which there were gaps in the system. I don't know about the accountability part because while they report through the R4V platform and what they're doing, the question would be who they're accountable to. Are they accountable to the people in Curacao and Aruba and Trinidad and Guyana? Or are they accountable to the migrant populations that they serve? Or are they accountable to the countries that they're representing since they're from overseas? So that would be my response to that. You're on mute, Meagan.
I see that Dr. Hall had a question for Maggie. I noticed your work examined Belize, Guyana, and the Yucatan Peninsula. Is there any consideration to include French Guiana and Suriname in the study?
Thank you. Thank you, Meagan. Thank you for the question. Yes would be the answer. I mean, but I haven't got at the moment got the resources. And not just, I mean, if we think about the map, there's a lot of space in between Belize Guyana also. I mean, I've jumped the whole of Central America. Before I move into if there is sufficient if time is kind to me, then if there is sufficient time, yes, I would love to work, particularly in Suriname. I met some amazing folks from Suriname and had long conversations. The cultural diversity in Suriname really would be fascinating, and Belize opens you up to that. I mean, the literature that I can work with in Belize is in different Maya languages, because there are 3 different Maya languages spoken in Belize. I would have to work with those in translation, and also in Spanish and also in English. But you see the same characters, popular characters cropping up from Yucatecan Spanish through to different Belizean Maya languages and also in English. And so I can just only imagine what will be happening in Suriname with that variety. I would love to be able to work there. I'm not sure if it's going to happen. First on my list, though, is to do more work in Costa Rica and Nicaragua, the Caribbean pockets in both, because both Costa Rica and Nicaragua are a little like Yucatan in that sense, that the regional Caribbean islandness is in tension with the Pacific side of the country, the other side of the country, or the national regional level. So there's a lot of tension between San Jose and Puerto Limon, for example, in Costa Rica. And I would like to explore more of the literature there before. I think I need to fill in some gaps before I expand in the Guyanas, but I would love to do that. Thank you.
Okay. I see comments being made, not necessarily questions. I think that G.J. Giddens has put a comment about being Guyanese, and that he will be presenting at CSA this year, or she would be presenting at CSA this year, I'm not sure. I would love to discuss the analysis of Guyana's readiness for, with appropriate immigration policies for Venezuelans, especially for natives. So I don't know if Natalie wants to respond. It's a comment. Comment that became a question.
So I noted the comment and the email contact.
Right, so that you will follow up in that regard. Okay. Let's see. All right. Good. Maggie, you wanted to say something? Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question to Natalie, because I think there's, as you said, there are some very interesting crossovers and synergies. One is more a comment. I was very interested to hear you speaking of Guyana as a Caribbean island. And that's one of, I mean, you said when you were describing the island nations that are receiving migrants from Venezuela, you made the point of saying that it was being looked upon as an island, and that was one of my problematical starting points with Yucatan, and I trace this back to again to colonial discourse, in the sense that nobody seemed to question, when I was going through the literature, that Guyana could be Caribbean, or that Guyana could be that Guyana could be Caribbean, despite the fact that it clearly was not an island, and that it was stuck in the middle of stuck at the northern end as a tiny little place in the northern end of a huge South American continent. And I thought, well, why is this not a problem? Whereas there were so many problems within the same literature to look at Yucatan as part of the Caribbean. So that was one of my starting points. So I was very interested, and when I started asking people in Guyana about Guyana as how it played out, the islandness, so at first people said, "Oh, don't call Guyana an island," and then a few years later, people said, "Oh, you're onto something really interesting there." So yes, of course, there's an islandness playing out in Guyana, and it's sort of stuck in this unusual place with huge countries around it that don't speak the same language. So I was interesting to see that continuity with this island or not island in the case of Guyana. But my question was actually more about the border conflict with Venezuela and how that is affecting migration to or from Guyana?
Yeah, so the short answer is it is. There was concern in Guyana that the returnees may influence election voting. And so there were attempts based on the border tensions to kind of close the border, I guess to keep people out, but also to assert sovereignty in a way over its territory. But based on how the border is, it's kind of difficult to keep people out. So they will enter, so they're entering primarily by land, but there are ways for them to get in through the rivers, for example. So it is something that informs the politics, and certainly the politics around the border regime. But maybe just to I have to go because I'm in a building that's gonna close. But to say about Guyana being considered a states, I thought about Gatsby-de-Geigel's definition of the Caribbean when you were speaking. And so that might be a useful entry point in terms of how we look at Guyana, because one of the arguments he makes is, so there's different ways that we can define the Caribbean, and historical, so the history of colonialism, the shared history of colonialism, but also just the mere fact of geography and being washed by the Caribbean Sea. And sharing that maritime space is one of the defining characteristics. And yes, people moving back and forth between the countries. So yeah.
Yeah, I went back to I go back to that to explain it as well. But that didn't explain why Yucatan was excluded.
Oh, okay.
I made sense why Guyana was in, but didn't make sense why Yucatan was out, because the same factors apply. But yeah, that was, yes, I wholly agree with you. Thank you very much for your answer.
Right. So in the interest of time, I think we need to, because I mean, one of the presenters has to leave. So I just want to take this opportunity. I think if persons share their email addresses in the chat, then they could follow up with those persons who they want to continue the conversation with. I want to take this opportunity on behalf of the Caribbean Studies Association to thank Dr. Shrimpton and Dr. Dietrich Jones for their presentations, as well as, of course, Dr. O'Neill Hall, whose idea it was to start CSA Voices. And of course, the president, Dr. Rhoda Arundel. My name is Meagan Sylvester, and I thank you for your participation and attendance. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye. Take care.
Thank you.